All right, well, I think we've got some people trickling in, but I do want to get us started so we have enough time to get through presentations and get to the Q&A session. But good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending this panel on Midwestern landscape transformations. My name is Philip Bowie. I just graduated from Purdue University, and our panel today has got a variety of topics, but we're very glad you could join us for the session. I want to make sure that we stay on time. So throughout the presentation, I would just ask that you make sure that you are muted so we don't have interruptions and we continue on through presentations. We're going to hold all the questions and comments until the end after everyone's presented. And I will introduce every speaker right before they do their talk. So just so that each presenter is aware, I will indicate whether you have like about 1 minute left by doing a thumbs up icon on my screen. That way that you don't run over too far. As well as another important note I wanted to make that Dr. Gregory Rose is unfortunately not able to be here today live in person, but I will be playing a recording that he put together of his presentation. He asked that if anyone has any questions or comments that that you send a question or comment to him in his email that can be found at the end of the video. So I guess I'll begin with myself since I'll be the first presentation on the panel. I grew up in rural Benton County, Indiana, but I completed my undergraduate degree at Albion College in history. And then just now have finished my education here for my master's degree at Purdue University. To share screen. Uh-oh. I think it's technical difficulties because it's not letting me do share screen.
So do you have the share screen bottom option at the bottom?
Yes. Oh, now it came up. Okay.
There you go.
Thank you. So my presentation today is titled Draining the Swamp, a social material study of 170 years of tile drainage in Midwestern agriculture and the development of the Gulf of Mexico's Hypoxic Zone. As I mentioned before, my name is Phil Bowie, and I've spent the first 18 years of my life in Northwestern Indiana. Growing up in Benton County, Indiana, I became familiar with the agricultural practices such as tile drainage, ditching, dredging, tilling, and chemical application. I became familiar with this by watching the neighboring farming operations from my family's forested property. My presentation today will discuss how tile drainage first became implemented in the Corn Belt and what effects it brought to the environment over the last approximately 170 years. But first, I'd like to acknowledge that all of the lands that I will be discussing today originally belong to indigenous groups, particularly in the area of Northwest Indiana. The land here, most of the land in this area belong to the Miami and Potawatomi native groups. One of the most important perspectives that I learned growing up from my parents was that the crop fields around our property were not always there, that this was not something that had always existed in the area. And that will be really critical to my analysis of this agricultural history of the Midwest. So I want to begin with what is subterranean tile drainage, because not everybody is familiar with what this technology is and how it got implemented in the Midwest beginning in the middle of the 19th century. So tile drainage is typically placed in wet soils in order to remove excess water. It has an outlet put at the lowest part of a crop field that drains the water through tubing into ditches and then to creeks and rivers and so on. And so this photo on the left-hand side of the screen is of a young child helping on the family farm in Benton County. This was done through the Farm Security Administration during the 1930s. Here is an agricultural diagram from the Ohio State University that demonstrates how the water table is actually dropped from the surface below by tiling. Today, tiling no longer is done with clay pieces that are interlocked. Today, it's done through corrugated plastic tubing that can be seen on the right side. And we have large machinery today that is developed in order to implement this tile technology efficiently. This diagram on the right helps to demonstrate a crop field with a ditch on the right-hand side. As the water flows through the tubing to the end of the field, it is deposited into an open ditch. I should note that this ditch is not a typical look for your everyday drainage ditch today. There's often no trees or shrubs or any kind of native species are often planted with different types of grasses that are shorter in order to keep flow moving and efficiency high. Most of my talk will be talking about the Grand Prairie region of the Midwest. This region stretched from all the way through Iowa, southern portions of Minnesota, Wisconsin, into parts of Illinois, northern Missouri, parts of Nebraska, and then even this northwestern part of Indiana. It is part of a drainage basin. It's called the Mississippi Drainage Basin that stretches from the Ohio River Valley all the way as far north as Saskatchewan, down through the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico. And this will be really, really crucial to understanding why a place so small and so rural as Benton County, Indiana, has connections to the hypoxic zones as far away as the Gulf of Mexico. I want to go into a little bit about the ecology of the Grand Prairie. This was a place that was very biodiverse, filled with vast amounts of insect life, plant life, and animal life. The grass particularly is of importance because most of the farming practices of crop farming would not be possible without the types of prairie grasses such as little blue stem and big blue stem, whose roots were approximately 20 feet down into the soil and helped hold soil in place, add nutrients to the soil, and built up a peat-like content in the topsoil. This manifested itself over millions of years into a very, very dense and deep topsoil level that farmers then would exploit in the 19th century to today. And I want to particularly give a recognition to the fact that this grass here, seen on the far left of the diagram, is your typical turf grass that you will find in front of your house or in the cityscape. And these grasses particularly have only very shallow roots in comparison to, say, the little blue stem, which you can see right next to it. And this has large impacts for years when there is less water, for periods, if you ever have been in Indiana area for a long period of time, you'll notice that we have heavy amounts of rain in the spring, dries up in July, and then we get lots of rain again in the fall. And this dry period is really important to have these grasses to hold in the moisture from spring and from fall. So what are the origins of tile technology and how was it brought here? And what are its ties to the settler colonial project? So tile technology was first brought to America and implemented by John Johnston in New York State in 1835. It was imported as a pattern from Scotland, but its original origins of clay tiles came from the British and before that, the Dutch. Really important to this story, however, is how was land acquired by the federal government so that tile drainage became the practice of most American farmers in the Midwest by the turn of the century. And that takes us to the Northwest Ordinances of 1784, 1785, and 1787. In these ordinances, the federal government asserted itself as the sole arbiter of the Old Northwest Territory, and it called the land public domain. This meant that they were asserting that it no longer belonged to indigenous groups, and it also laid out a blueprint for westward expansion by creating a grid-like pattern of townships and counties. On the right-hand side of the screen, I have some quotes from particularly important political figures during this early time period. Thomas Jefferson, in particular, to a letter to then William Henry Harrison, the governor of the Old Northwest Territory, in 1803 wrote that he glad to see the good and influential individuals among them, the Indians, run in debt, because we observe that when these debts get beyond what individuals can pay, they become willing to lop them off by cession of lands. This was one of the tactics employed in order to gain native lands in Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio, and Michigan. And by the mid-19th century, there are arguments to create roads and a Northwest Passage throughout the continental United States in a westward expansion. Thomas Hart Benton was one of the biggest proponents for creating roads, as well as a big proponent for the drainage of swamplands throughout the country. And he quoted from his Senate speech in 1849, he wrote, "The Romans, from whom we borrow so many of our ideas, useful or grand, never considered a conquered territory, added to the Republic or the Empire, until it was perforated by a road." Thomas Hart Benton and other legislators at the national level viewed swamplands as impediments to progress, impediments which needed to be drained in order for agricultural production to be increased on that land. From 1849 to 1904, the draining of swamplands became a legislative reality. The Swampland Act of 1849 was the first act to pass Congress. This act only applied to the state of Louisiana. It's particularly important to note that this is the very first Swampland Act because it begins in the South. And in Louisiana, historians have written about the fact that this was often used to extend white plantation ownership into lands that were currently inundated at that time. And so this was not just an expansion of efficiency and production in the South, but it was also a way of exerting more control through the political and land practices. The Swampland Act of 1850, which followed that act, was very similar to the one passed for Louisiana, and this covered many states, particularly Indiana and several other states in the Midwest. Because the United States during the 1780s had acquired through public domain the land of the Midwest, it then sought to sell the excess land in order to pay off its debts. It had war debts and other issues in terms of how to fund expanding infrastructure. Land speculation arrived in the Northwest area of Indiana, and this allowed for some of the earliest settlers to the area, or I should say the earliest land buyers, not all moved here, to become millionaires off of the sale of land and through the implementation of tenant farming practices. There was also a booming wholesale grocery market as settlers moved into the area. Particularly of note is Moses Fowler and John Purdue. But the first millionaires in the area in terms of tenant farming were Henry L. Ellsworth, his son Henry W. Ellsworth, and Edward Sumner. Together they held a pseudo monopoly on Northwest Indiana crop production, as well as cattle production and parts of Illinois as well. The first drainage ditches were implemented by these tenant farmers. This was done through the 1860s and 1870s. It took some time to actually sell the swampland that was available at the time. And it also led to an almost bankruptcy of the state because it was not an efficient process of selling land. The first drainage ditches and tiling that were implemented were done through the exploitation of Irish immigrant labor. And this led to the draining of small lakes and the wet prairie in Benton County, Indiana, as well as the draining of Indiana's largest lake, Beaver Lake, from 1853 to 1889 in Jasper County, Indiana. The map on this side can show you that this led to an increased production and profitability of cropland. This is a map of Indiana's most valuable cropland by 1920. And you can see here Benton County and Jasper County just north of it. Moses Fowler and John Purdue are notable mentions. They came here to this area as to set up a wholesale grocery market in Lafayette, Indiana. They had ties in particular to Louisiana sugar production and were mass selling sugar in the area to new settlers. And this is what helped them generate an immense amount of wealth to become millionaires. Eventually, Moses Fowler would go on to change the county seat of Benton County to a new town named after him, located today in Fowler, Indiana. And John Purdue would go on to donate his wealth and his lands to found the land that Purdue currently sits on. The Purdue Agricultural Experiment Station and Institutionalizing Power. Purdue University in 1869, from funds and land donated by John Purdue, this was done through the Land Grant College Act. It was passed in 1862. And then Professor William C. Latta was one of the first agricultural science teachers at the university. Through the Hatch Act of 1887, Professor Latta was really important in administering and establishing the Purdue Agricultural Experiment Station in 1887. Throughout the state, this led to a professionalization of seed hybridization, soil testing. It sought to fight soil erosion, and that was only done through terracing and tree row planting. But it did argue, despite knowing that there was soil exploitation happening, it was still arguing for drainage improvements throughout the area. By the turn of the century into the 1920s, we have a lot of troublesome floods happening throughout Indiana, as well as the Midwest, that many of you might be familiar with historically. It created the tile technology, I argue, created an increased frequency of 100-year floods. This resulted in the flood of 1913, the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927, and the Great Flood of 1937. Because tile drainage is interested in increasing the flow of water, the efficiency of water through the land, this meant that water would be funneled out of previous wetlands and directly put into rivers. And when rain would fall in high amounts, as it did in most of these occurrences, it would lead to massive floods. It also led us to Dust Bowl-like conditions in Northwest Indiana. The Dust Bowl in the US is one of many globally, but Dust Bowl-like conditions came to Benton, Warren, Newton, Jasper, and White counties in 1936. In the 1980s, during the farm crisis, the tile technology was grandfathered in. This became grandfathered in through legislation passed during the 1985 Farm Bill during financial collapse of the market surrounding crop grains. The Gulf of Mexico is experiencing and has been experiencing for several years a hypoxic zone. Hypoxia is created through the use from excess nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus entering into the water and creating an algae bloom and low oxygen. This leads to fish die-offs as well as influencing changes to other microbiology. Okay. Thank you. All right. Next up, we have Katherine Howe from the University of Arizona. Katherine Howe is a third-year PhD student at the University of Arizona, studying economic history and industrial organization under Dr. Price Fishback. She earned her undergraduate degrees in economics and in mathematics at the University of Iowa. Her dissertation, which analyzes both the mechanisms behind the decision to purchase or homestead land in Kansas and the causal effects of that decision, is in 4 parts. The first chapter predicts settler decisions to purchase or homestead from the land characteristics at the farm level. The second chapter examines selection into purchasing and homesteading based on heterogeneous production functions. The third chapter estimates the option value created by homesteading using a multi-period structural model. The final chapter explores the effect of the decision to homestead on the subsequent rate and method of farm consolidation over time. She has been awarded several grants from the Economic History Association, the University of Arizona, and presented her work at invited conferences at the Young Scholars Institute, the Economics History Association meetings, the Association for Mentoring and Inclusion in Economics, and the Western Economic History International Conference. Katherine, if you want to take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me here today to talk about this paper that I'm working on, two different types of settlers, the effects of selection into purchasing and homesteading. So to give you some background, the Homestead Act of 1863 was one of the most influential land laws in the United States history. And what it did was it granted about 3 million plots of land in the western part of the United States to be given out by the federal government to individual settlers to be farmed. And Kansas was one of the current states most heavily impacted, which leads us to looking at the idea of what was the extent and through what mechanisms did the Homestead Act change agricultural productivity and settler types. And when we evaluate this question, we want to note specifically the potential effect of selection here, meaning that potentially different types of people selected into homesteading, and that can have an impact on the subsequent agricultural productivity. So to give you some background here, during this time period, settlers had two main ways to acquire land from the federal government in the late 1800s. They could either purchase it directly or they could homestead. Purchasing was more expensive. However, it meant that they got the title to the land immediately. Homesteading, on the other hand, was so inexpensive that it was nearly free. However, the settler did not get the title immediately and instead had to stay on the land for 5 to 7 years before they got the title. It's also notable that the same land in this sample was available for both homesteading and for purchase. So it's not like the government gave better land as purchase and worse land as homestead grants. So this paper makes the following contribution in the sense that nearly all the previous economic literature on this topic assumes that purchasers and homesteaders were the same type, meaning that they have the same production function and goals. And so that means that the papers have ascribed the causal effects of the long-term differences in outcomes on land initially purchased and initially homesteaded to the method of acquisition. However, this analysis has been largely done at the county level, which means that they're unable to control for settler demographics and therefore have to assume that there is no selection, as we discussed earlier about selection into purchasing and homesteading at the individual level. However, at the beginning of this paper, I show that selection into purchasing does exist, which clearly complicates the empirical setting. So the idea here is that purchasers were plausibly wealthier at the time that they acquired land. Because purchasing was more expensive, they were plausibly wealthier. This level of wealth is generally unobservable. If they were wealthier, they could have then put more money into their farm and then had higher productivity subsequently. And then the the decision to purchase would not be the causal mechanism behind the higher productivity, but instead just the fact that these purchasers were wealthier. So I'm using three main data sources in order to look at the effect of the Homestead Act on agricultural productivity and settler types. The first is the 1870 and 1880 Kansas Agricultural Census, which details the value of farm output at the individual farm level. So things like how many bushels of corn did each farm produce, how many bushels of wheat did each farm produce, etc. Then the assessed value of the farm, which is essentially the value of the title. And then the second data source is the Bureau of Land Management tract books for Kansas, which detail how and when the land was initially acquired. So if it was purchased and if it was homesteaded and when. And then finally, various individual soil, water, precipitation, town and railroad access, demographic controls, individual controls, including soil, water, and other land characteristics. So to take a sort of a first pass at considering the effect of the initial decision to either purchase or homestead on subsequent farm productivity and value, we can use two different types of models. The first is an OLS model, which just looks at the relationship between the decision to purchase and the subsequent farm productivity and value, where the dependent variable is either the farm productivity or the farm value in the census year. Then we have alpha and gamma as township range year and county year fixed effects. Purchase is a binary variable that says it's 1 if they purchase and 0 if they homestead. And then X is a vector of land and settler controls. However, if there is this effect of selection, as we discussed earlier, where potentially wealthier people select into purchasing and then they are able to put more money into their farm and then their farm is more productive in the future, the OLS coefficient beta will be biased. So instead we can use an IV method where the instrumental variable is the distance to the land office. So the idea here is that if they homesteaded, they had to go to the land office twice. And if they purchased, they went once. So on the margin, people who are closer to the land office would be more likely to homestead, and people who were farther from the land office would be more likely to purchase. So the land office was basically a government agent or a government office, part of the Bureau of Land Management, which distributed the patents to these tracts of land. There were about 8 in Kansas at this time period. And so that meant that the land office was on average about 30 miles away from any one of these farms. So going to the land office could be a significant cost. That was about 5 hours of travel on horseback on average. So this could be a significant cost of at least a day or sometimes 2 days to go to the land office to get the patent and fill out the paperwork. So we can use the distance to the land office to predict whether or not they purchased the land, and then use that predicted purchase to estimate the causal effect of the initial decision to purchase or homestead on subsequent farm productivity and value after factoring out the effect of selection. So what we're going to find is that the OLS results show highly different farming strategies between purchasing and homesteading, but after we factor out selection, we don't see that same difference. So these are the results there. This first column is the first stage IV, which shows how well the distance to the land office basically predicts the decision to purchase. And then the second and fourth columns are the OLS results, and the third and fifth columns are the IV results. So what we see here is that purchase is highly significantly related to having a more valuable farm, so the higher value of the title. However, the decision to purchase is also highly related to having a less productive farm. So that means that the people who purchased had a farm with a higher value of the title per acre. However, they were not actually using that farm to produce as much crop and livestock output as homesteaders. However, when we eliminate the effect of selection into purchasing and homesteading, we see that the same general pattern holds. However, it's no longer significant. And what that basically tells us is the following: that the OLS results show these highly significant differences between purchasers and homesteaders, where homesteaders farm and produce crops and livestock, and they use the farm basically to produce agricultural goods. On the other hand, purchasers make durable improvements to their land, like fences, which improve the value of the title. So these are two different farming strategies, basically, because they represent two different ways in which people can invest money into their farms to get a return. However, when we look at the instrumental variable results, we don't see these same differences in farming strategies. So the IB results, again, factor out the effect of selection into purchase or selection into homesteading, and just look at the causal effect of the decision to either purchase or homestead on the productivity and value in the future. And so without this effect of selection, we don't see these same differences in farming strategies. So when we take these results together, what that implies is that there are differences in farming strategies, like out there in the universe of purchasers and homesteaders in Kansas. However, the causal mechanism is not necessarily the method of acquisition, right? Which makes sense. We don't necessarily assume that the decision to purchase causes people to invest more in their fences versus in their crops. So what this paper mostly does is develop a model of heterogeneous production and value, which shows how exogenous differences in production functions can lead to selection into purchasing or homesteading. And once we have that, we can then show why some settlers initially invested in improvements like fences and others invested in crops and livestock. So basically, we are creating a model which uses the legal requirements of purchasing and homesteading to demonstrate which settlers would have selected into purchase and which would have selected into homesteading, and then show that once they did, that causes them to have different decisions about investments. So we start by modeling two ways which farmers can improve returns to their farm. The first is from physical improvements such as fences and buildings, which are always sold with the farm, so they increase the value of the title. The other is from production such as crops and livestock, which are not necessarily sold with the farm. So that gives us the following utility functions, which basically say the utility of the farm or the utility of the title is a function where there's the returns to the value function, which is a function of the improvements like fences and the land characteristics, minus the cost of those improvements. Then we have the utility of production, which is a function equal to the returns from production, where the production function rho is a function of the land characteristics and the crop and livestock specific investments like seeds, minus the cost of those seeds. So we can add homesteading to the model in the following way. So we want to add the decision to either purchase or homestead to this model. And we can do that by looking at the differences in the costs and the returns. So we make the following assumptions. The first is that C1 and C2, which are the market costs for things like investments in fences and investments in seeds, are the same for purchasers and homesteaders. The second is that the R2, the returns to selling crops and livestock, are also the same for purchasers and homesteaders. So what these assumptions mean is basically that there were many, many small farms in an area. Each of these farms were price takers in the market, and none of them were able to influence market costs or market returns substantially. However, we're going to assume that the returns for purchasers, the returns to the title for purchasers were greater than the returns to the title for homesteaders. And basically that's because of what we talked about at the very beginning of this presentation, where purchasers get the title more quickly than homesteaders. So that means that they're able to resell the title, resell the farm, or mortgage the farm more quickly. So that means that the purchasers' returns to the durable farm improvements, like fences, are going to be higher than homesteaders. So we're essentially implicitly time discounting here, where we're saying they're getting a higher return because they don't have to wait for that return. So then we can add some heterogeneity in this model, which leads to selection. So the general idea is that each person or each farmer has their own production and value function, which is exogenous to the model and cannot be chosen by the settler. So meaning basically that each farmer has an amount of ability at either producing crops or producing livestock. Some people are better at building fences, and some people are better at planting crops. So we can consider the farmer with the following production and value function, which basically means that at any level of monetary investment, this farmer is better at building fences than planting crops. So again, the idea is just that some people are good at building fences and some people are good at planting crops. That gives them the following utility function, where D is just the level such that the dollar amount invested in improvements like fences and invested in investments like seeds is the same. So that gives us the following mathematical result, which in the interest of time, I'll just go over in words. Basically, it says that if a farmer is better at building fences than planting crops, and if the returns to investing in improvements like fences are higher for purchasers than for homesteaders, then the farmer will choose to purchase and will choose to invest more money in fences than in seeds. So basically what this model shows is that there are exogenous innate differences in production and value function among settlers, and that causes them to select into either purchasing or homesteading. And then once they do make that selection, those same exogenous differences cause them to choose specific types of investments, either investments into durable farm improvements like fences or buildings, or investments into consumable goods like crops and livestock. So we can test this model in a couple ways, which I'll just briefly cover here. So first, we can use a Cobb-Douglas production function, basically to calculate each settler's production value function and estimate the production functions separately for purchasers and homesteaders. And if the coefficients of interest are significantly different between the two groups, that means that they have different production and value functions, basically. So they're using the same inputs differently to create value. We can also estimate the production and value functions more directly on a sample of the settlers, which includes only people who acquired more than 2 pieces of land. So basically, this means that all pieces of land after the first 160 acres had to be purchased, not homesteaded. And so we can use this group of people who acquired more than 2 pieces of land to say, okay, let's look at only their subsequent pieces of land, which all had to be purchased. We can determine their production and value function on those pieces of land, and then use that to predict whether or not they purchased the first piece of land. So what we would expect to find is that people who have a higher value function than production function estimated from their second piece of land would be more likely to purchase their first piece of land. whereas people who have a higher production function to value function from their second piece of land would be more likely to homestead their first piece of land. So here we can estimate the Cobb-Douglas production function. And basically, we're saying that production is a function of the farm value, the fertilizer cost, the machinery value, settler and land controls, and some fixed effects. So the idea here is that the fertilizer cost and the machinery value are things which are only relevant if we're actually producing crops, right? We don't need fertilizer if we're not actually producing crops. So we're looking at the sort of crop and livestock specific investments here. And we can do the same thing with the farm value or the value of the title. So these are the results here. And what we see here is if we look at, say, fence cost per acre, we can see that the first two columns are for purchasers and the second two columns are for homesteaders. So if we look at the fence cost per acre, we can see that there's a significant difference between the coefficients between purchasers and homesteaders. So the purchasers have a higher coefficient on fence cost per acre. So what this says is that for every $1 per acre of fence costs of fencing that they invest, purchasers are getting a higher return. Their value of their title is increasing more for every $1 invested in fences than for homesteaders. And then we see a similar pattern for all of these investments, meaning that purchasers and homesteaders do in fact have this different production functions. They're using inputs differently.
In the interest of time, we're going to need to continue on to our next presenter.
Okay.
I apologize.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see you raise your hand. I was actually thinking to myself, like, is he not done yet?
I sent a couple of messages, but it's all right. We can move on then to the video for Dr. Rose's presentation. So Dr. Gregory S. Rose is Dean and Director of The Ohio State University at Marion and Associate Professor of Geography. His bachelor degrees in geography and history are from Valparaiso University, Indiana. His master's and doctorate degrees in geography from Michigan State University. His research area is in the 19th century Midwest. He has researched and published on birthplace origins and previous residences of immigrant populations using census nativity data and genealogical records, their cultural impacts in the Midwest, the region's historical economic development, and definitions of the Midwest according to cultural elements, vernacular perceptions, agricultural areas, and the environment.
Good morning, I'm Greg Rose from Ohio State Marion, and I appreciate the opportunity to present my paper to you in this virtual mode. The title of my paper is Who Settled the Corn Belt in 1880? There are various outlines of the Corn Belt, as you can see from this map, and lots of other ones out there. I've generalized from this map predominantly to provide an outline that you'll see on subsequent slides. So why 1880? Prototypes of the agricultural complex that became the Midwest Corn Belt had developed already in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Kentucky in the early 1800s. The Midwest's first examples appeared in the Ohio, Scioto, and Miami River valleys. And there are outlines of the Corn Belt clearly present in maps of corn production published in the Agricultural Census of 1880, which is why 1880 was chosen. But they're identifiable even earlier. Then also, shortly after 1880, the term was first applied to this agricultural region, from Western Ohio through Eastern Nebraska, Kansas, the Dakotas, plus Northern Missouri and parts of Southern Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. And finally, by 1880, agricultural settlement was beginning in the western margins of the Corn Belt. So the prompt that got this paper started. Because the core counties of the Corn Belt in the Midwest, quote, were settled prior to 1850 by the sons and daughters who had lived in the 5 islands where the agricultural type originated, the Corn Belt was expanding north and west as a result of the transplanting an agricultural type from one region to another through migration. This is from John Hudson's Making the Corn Belt book of 1994. And so the through migration part is what really is the prompt. So this prompt raised a couple of questions. Were the Corn Belt counties of the Midwest populated by a different mix of settlers compared to the entirety of each state? Were foreign natives as common or more common in the Corn Belt counties of the Midwestern states compared to the remainder of the state? And finally, is it possible to follow the western movement of the predominant Corn Belt nativity groups from areas further to the east in the Corn Belt to further west? And did this result in a distinctive distribution of nativity groups farther west in the Corn Belt? So the methodology was to consult nativity tables in the 1880 census. These list the top 10 domestic and foreign birthplaces by county for those counties that were within the Corn Belt. I transferred the information to spreadsheets for each Corn Belt county in each state. I determined the percentage of the immigrant population, that is, those not born in the state of residence, from each domestic or foreign birthplace. I then determined the average percentage across the Corn Belt represented by each source of immigrants. And finally, I generated maps based on the 1880 county boundaries, showing concentration or comparative absence based on standard deviations about the mean. So as we go forward, it's going to be a map test, and we'll start pretty soon. So the first set of questions, were the Corn Belt counties in the Midwest populated by a different mix of settlers? And were foreign natives as common or more common? So here are the basic metrics as we look across. And the Corn Belt average, we're just looking at that at the moment. Ohio natives were the largest immigrant group across the Corn Belt in 1880, with almost 12%. Interestingly, New York natives were almost at the same. Natives of Germany were also very close to that. And then Pennsylvania, Illinois, and we follow through. The percentages were quite high in some states and quite low in others. So New Yorkers, for example, 39% of the immigrants in the Corn Belt areas, or Germans, 22% in Ohio, or in Wisconsin, natives of Norway and Sweden, 24% in the Corn Belt areas. And then at the other end, there were some pretty low percentages, hardly any Wisconsin natives, for example, or hardly any Indiana natives in Wisconsin. Here's another way to look at it. It's kind of a complex diagram here, but really what I was trying to show on this was those areas where the Corn Belt had a higher percentage than statewide were identified in yellow. And it's pretty much a mix in some places, although you'll notice for the New Yorkers, they were typically much higher in the Corn Belt, or at least somewhat higher in the Corn Belt than they were in other areas. So it was a mix back and forth in some cases. So then on to the other question about the Germans. So all of the maps that follow are going to follow the same pattern. The blue is the highest percentage, which is 1 standard deviation or greater than the mean. The brown is from the mean to 1 standard deviation. The red is from the mean to 1 standard deviation below. And the yellow is below 1 standard deviation below the mean. So these are where the Germans live. And you notice it's a pretty interesting pattern here. So there were some concentration zones, Northwest Ohio, down the Illinois River Valley, and then up into parts of Wisconsin, Minnesota, and the Dakotas, and then also in western Nebraska. But it's kind of a scattered pattern of the German natives, although they were a considerable number of foreigners. The Swedes and the Norwegians are also an interesting group. In the census, they put both of them together. So Norway and Sweden were together as a single group, which accounted for them together, accounting for 7.65% of immigrants. But if we look at their concentration, you clearly see a concentration in the northwestern parts of the Corn Belt. And that means Minnesota and Dakota in particular. Even though, although you don't see it on this map, in Wisconsin, natives of Norway and Sweden were 24% of the Corn Belt immigrants, but they were very heavily concentrated in a couple of areas. And in the Dakotas, they were 15.5% of the immigrants. The Irish natives, I didn't split this out into standard deviation groups. There they are on average about 5.1%, but they were pretty scattered. So you saw them in parts of Ohio, again, down the Illinois River Valley, and then scattered in other places. And here's a bonus map. These are the Canadians. So on average, they were only a little over 2%, but you clearly saw the Canadians' orientation into the north. So here's our questions and answers for the first set. Were the Corn Belt counties populated by a different mix of settlers? And the answer to that is yes, generally. A higher percentage of natives of Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, New York, and Pennsylvania were in the Corn Belt areas farther west. Were foreign natives as common or more common in the Corn Belt? And the answer there is a mix. For the Germans, that was a yes in Minnesota, Michigan, Kansas, and Dakota, but clearly not in Wisconsin. The heavily German areas were east of the Corn Belt zone. And we saw the German concentrations. For the natives of Norway and Sweden, the answer was yes in Wisconsin, Kansas, and Dakota, but not in Minnesota. The Norwegians and Swedes were primarily in non-Corn Belt areas of Minnesota. And then the Irish, as we saw, in a very scattered pattern. So the second set of questions, is it possible to follow the westward movement of the predominant Corn Belt nativity groups from areas further east to the Corn Belt areas further west? And did this result in a distinctive distribution of nativity groups farther west in the Corn Belt? So to answer this, we go into the maps again. Ohio is the largest percentage, 11.72% of the immigrants. Immigrants, I should have said earlier, defined as those not born in the state of residence. So here are the Ohioans. You see them very strongly in Indiana, as you would anticipate. So it's a directly westward group here for the Ohioans. A large area in part of Illinois and a large area in areas of Iowa, but sort of a gradual decline as you get further west, in particular as you head to the northwest. Pennsylvania natives, although that's outside the Corn Belt, had a very similar pattern to that of Ohio natives. And so I threw them in as another bonus. Ohio, of course, was heavily settled by Pennsylvanians, but you see them following the same sort of pretty much directly westward pattern and a diminution as you get further west. Natives of Indiana, as you would anticipate, heavily found in parts of Illinois, also in Iowa, Kansas, and Nebraska, but pretty much straight west from Indiana. And the same is true for the natives of Illinois. So very heavily found in parts of Iowa and in Nebraska, and also in the northern Missouri parts of the Corn Belt. So you see them again moving pretty much directly west. And then finally, natives from Iowa in the surrounding states. You see again that strongly westward pattern there, also into the northern parts of Missouri and parts of Kansas. It's a much smaller group, of course, because we're not looking at them having moved eastward. And typically, these are the only states in which the Iowa natives were listed among the top 10 in the census. So here's New York. New York was a very heavily source of immigrants, just barely below Ohio. And the New York pattern is a pretty interesting one. So New Yorkers were pretty generally distributed across, as you see here, but they also had some concentration. And so the higher areas, the blue and the brown, tended to be a little bit further north. So while New York was not in the traditional Corn Belt zone, there were New Yorkers living in the Corn Belt, particularly in some locations. For example, you see them very heavily concentrated in southern Michigan. In fact, New Yorkers represented just over 30% of all immigrants in the Corn Belt areas of Michigan, and again, in a part of northeastern Illinois and just over the line into Wisconsin. But their orientation was a little bit further north, more northerly focus. Here are the natives of Kentucky. This is a little bit more difficult because for Iowa, Minnesota, Dakotas, and Nebraska, Kentuckians weren't in the top 10 group. So they're missing altogether in the count, although they certainly were there. But if you see their pattern here, obviously they were a significant number of individuals in Indiana and across southern Illinois, and then into the northern parts of Missouri. But a much more southerly orientation, at least for the data that we have. So question and answer for the second set. Is it possible to follow the westward movement of the predominantly Corn Belt nativity groups from areas further east and further west? And I think it is very much so. The settlers from the key Corn Belt states, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa, tended to spread most generally across the region, strongly to the west, in each case, with a gradual decline further west, and the Pennsylvanians following a similar pattern. New Yorkers, they were from outside the Corn Belt region, but the second largest source of immigrants, and their tendency was to shift northward. The Kentuckians, as I mentioned, not included among the top 10 for all of those states, tended to stay a little further south. So that's the presentation. We see those settlers having made it westward. John Hudson had it right, which is a good thing to know as a historical geographer. And this at least provides a picture of how the Corn Belt was in fact settled out of previous Corn Belt states further west into the new Corn Belt states. As you see, sorry I can't be with you in person today, but any questions I'd be happy to take. rose.9@osu.edu. Thank you.
All right, on to our last presentation, certainly not least. We have Dr. Christopher Langen, who is a professor of geography at Eastern Illinois University. His fields of interest include rural and agricultural land use change. He is a co-author of American Farms, American Food, a geography of agriculture and food production in the United States with John Hudson of Northwestern University. He's a contributing author to 2 recent books edited by John Locke, The Interior Borderlands, Regional Identity in the Midwest and Great Plains, and Finding a New Midwestern History.
All right, thank you very much. Station up. All right. Thank you everyone for attending. I became a rural geographer when I was a student at South Dakota State University in the late 1990s. I enrolled there because of how great the hunting and fishing was, not knowing that I'd stumbled into a program that hosted the an annual geography convention, where each year a dozen or so high-profile geographers would come present their research, but more importantly, to interact and socialize with undergraduate students. I was fortunate in 1999 to meet a stalwart of the convention and of geography, University of Minnesota geographer John Fraser Hart. Shortly after the convention, my advisor at SDSU gave me a paper that Fraser had written with a student of his where they mapped abandoned farmsteads. I was fascinated, having grown up on a farm just east of their study area. So, like any good aspiring undergrad, but with Fraser's permission, I copied his study and mapped abandoned farms in Odin Township, which is located in Watonwan County in south central Minnesota. I began studying old aerial photos and through field work compared them with what was present in 1999. In this image from the 1930s, my family's farm was in the white square and the 5 yellow circles were all functioning farms. By 1999, those 5 farms were gone. This work became my first conference poster presentation, my first conference paper presentation, and my first publication. I was lucky to be able to catch some of the abandoning happening, and I was lucky to add to what Fraser's study had done by looking at what was happening to some of these former farm sites. And what I found was that some of them were being converted into sites for confinement hog barns. My home county, Watonwan, borders Martin County, which is the 6th largest hog producing county in the nation with nearly 3 million hogs sold in 2017. Sales of hogs in Watonwan County grew from only 62,000 in 1940 to just shy of 1 million by 2017. While at the same time, the number of farms with hogs dropped from 1,200 to only 70. Why build confinement hog barns on a site of an abandoned farm? Well, the land is already being used, so no cropland has to be taken out of production. Utilities such as electricity and water are already present, and maybe most importantly, if the former farm had a livestock permit on file with the county, very often that permit is transferred over to the new owners. So that brings us to today. With the original study being 2 decades old, I figured this was as good of a time as any to revisit this topic and study area to see what's happened since. So let's step back a few scales. The study is really about disappearance. This map shows counties with lost population over the last 6 census intervals. The largest area of continued population loss is found over much of the Great Plains and Western Midwest. Fraser Hart and Mark Lindbergh zoomed into the state level and measured the same type of loss at the township. Here we see a pattern of population loss where there weren't many people to begin with, and Minnesota's most productive agricultural regions. Looking at my home county, the yellow X, and those that surround it, we can see population moving westward from the Minnesota River Valley in the 1880s as homesteaders entered this part of the state. By the 1930s, population density was at its greatest, with most townships 15 people per square mile. Makes sense if you consider 4 farm families per every 1 square mile section. By 1970, the effects of the industrialization of agriculture that began just after World War II are evident as many rural residents moved off of the landscape. And by 2010, most of the area, minus the region's largest towns and their surrounding hinterlands, had densities between 5 and 10 people per square mile, with most of those not being farmers. To the passerby, it doesn't look like much has changed. Here's our farm from the era in the 1950s, a very typical Midwestern Corn Belt farm with a tree grove, farmhouse, barn, and other outbuildings. By the 1970s, the house had been added onto, and a new metal machine shed had. By 2010, the house had been added onto even more. Most of the smaller outbuildings have been taken down. Further, this ceased being an actual farm in the 1980s, in so much as my parents were both employed full-time off the farm. Looking at the rural population of my study area, Odin Township, we can see that population reached its high water mark in the 1920s, but has declined every decade since. All told, a 73% loss. My mapping efforts 20 years ago looked like this for Odin Township. Over nearly a half century, there was a loss of 52 farm sites in 1959. Those that were either vacant, the yellow squares, or demolished entirely, the red X's. Here's what I found driving around Odin Township in 2019 in my update of this work. A few more yellow squares and red X's have popped up on the map. The map takes a little bit of time to absorb, so here are the details. There were 0 new housing sites constructed, unless you count hog barns. This is the newest addition to the township's hog barn inventory, and the construction of it was visible on Google Earth in 2015. 4 sites that were vacant in 1999 are today occupied. These were houses and sites that were recently vacated, so the houses themselves were not in bad shape, though in this instance, the original farmhouse had been replaced by a more modern ranch-style home. 11 sites occupied in 1999 are today vacant and quickly falling into disrepair. 9 sites that were vacant in 1999 are gone entirely today. And again, turning to a 2011 image of this area in Google Earth, we can see how quickly an occupied and a vacant farm site can change into a vacant site and one that's been erased from the landscape. The vacant site then converted to a confined hog barn, which we're going to catch of in 2013. And what are probably the most dramatic are those that go from being very recently occupied to being immediately demolished. 5 of these transitions occurred within my 36 square mile area. In May of 2011, the recently vacated site is easily visible on Google Earth. 4 months later, the only evidence that it ever existed was where the corn had been planted around it. And by the following spring, any evidence of its existence was gone. On a somewhat parallel note, other structures that share these rural landscapes are also disappearing. As rural populations decline, rural church congregation sizes have declined right alongside. And in the case of the Kansas Lake Evangelical Lutheran Church, a church that resided on this site for nearly 140 years, only a gravestone in its own cemetery marks its past presence. All told, the overall loss of farm sites in Odin Township over the past 20 years shows a slow transition. 12 occupied sites in 1999 have today been either abandoned or destroyed, a 15% loss over a 20-year period. For reference, 52 sites were abandoned or destroyed during my first nearly 50-year study period. So this is an active but slowing trend. To a more detail-oriented observer, changes have occurred that relate to the evolving agricultural systems of the US. Houses have changed. In many cases, remodeling has been done to the point where the original house is barely visible. Barns like this one once stood as the centerpiece of nearly every Corn Belt farm, when all types of livestock were present, when cows were milked, and when hay had to be stored for winter use, have become redundant. And they too have been purposely removed from the landscape. Sheds that were built or retrofitted decades ago to store farm machinery that kept bigger and bigger after horses were replaced by tractors are today themselves being replaced as machinery continues to grow in size. Simply put, there are fewer but bigger farms on today's agricultural landscape, but the amount of land being farmed in Minnesota or even nationally hasn't changed all that much, which means that something has also changed with regard to farmland ownership. Using the square mile section where my family's farm is, in 1950, those 5 landowners seen on the map lived on and farmed the land they owned. By 2015, those 5 parcels had been subdivided into 9. Further, the only person listed there in 2015 as an owner that actually lived on their land was my dad, and he's not a farmer. With this, I started looking into who the landowners were and tried to calculate how far they lived from the land they owned. My dad's parcel is 0 miles because, again, he lives there. But his sister, who owned the 80 acres to our west, lives 240 miles away in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. In our 1 square mile section, the average distance to owner is 90 miles. So I thought it might be fun to look at all of Odin Township. I was able to contact the county assessor's office and get ownership information. After digitizing in all the parcels, I placed a point in the center of each one of the 237 parcels of land. And I drew an as the crow flies line to where the landowners live. All told, there were over 13,000 miles of ownership distance in Odin Township for an average of 55 miles. 70% of the owners live less than 100 or 10 miles away. 20% live between 10 and 100 miles away, with 4 owners living over 1,000 miles away from the farmland that they own. The study would not be complete without also taking a peek at what's happening in the town of Odin. Much, but it's emblematic of the connection between these small towns and the surrounding landscapes. Population loss in the town of Odin has not been as severe as that of the surrounding countryside, though the town's purpose of supporting that countryside is greatly diminished. Because of increased scales of production, Odin's grain elevator on the Union Pacific line no longer loads passing trains. The rail sidings were removed and the facility was purchased by a local farmer for grain storage. The town's gas station and furniture store have been vacant for decades. The Odin feed mill, which once custom mixed livestock feed for local cattle and hog farmers, had its grain bins removed back in the 1990s, as more and more of the local hogs were owned and fed by a growing number of hog producing businesses, such as Christensen Farms, located near Sleepy Eye, Minnesota, one of the largest family-owned pork producers in the country. The Odin feed mill has since become the Odin Craft. A local woman who enjoys crafts bought the building and even moved in a barn and an old Montgomery Ward's catalog farmhouse to the property. And a few times, craft enthusiasts from around the region come and peddle their products. Because the surrounding countryside is largely unchanged, the Odin State Bank still does good business, primarily loaning ever-increasing sums of money to the dwindling number of local farmers and landowners in the area. And in the off-season, the farmers still need somewhere to go and have coffee, so that's done at the Odin grocery store and cafe. Maybe the most telling sign of the downward trajectory of this small town, a town in the heart of Minnesota Vikings football country, is revealed by simply driving the street. Our country's rural landscapes generally change very slowly. Nationally, the amount of land used in the U.S. to grow crops has changed very little over a century, hovering between 300 and 350 million acres. Where after the initial pileup of the Prairie in the late 1800s, and nearly every year since, somewhere between 80 and 85% of the county's land area has been used to grow crops. And the same goes for Odin Township as well. Though the amount of land used to grow crops has changed only slightly, the crops that are grown have changed significantly. From a system where farmers once grew a number of crops, including hay to feed their livestock, to cash grain farming with a focus on growing corn and soybeans for sale immediately or shortly after harvest. Agriculture has experienced both an implosion in the number of farms needed to grow the food, fuel, and fiber that our country produces, as machinery got bigger and fewer farmers were needed to do the work, and an explosion in crop and livestock production driven by technological advancements and ever-growing efficiencies in production capabilities. Big successful farms will continue to get bigger. In 1925, 98% of Minnesota farms were smaller than 500 acres in size, but those farms farmed 93% of the state's farmland. By 2017, Minnesota's biggest farms, the 20% that were bigger than 500 acres, were now farming nearly 80% of the state's farmland. So will farms continue to disappear across certain parts of the country? Without a doubt. Since the 1930s, 7 out of every 10 US farms have disappeared, but many of today's farms that meet the $1,000 production threshold, a threshold that's been used since 1974, aren't producing all that much food. So don't be misled by the flat line that you see since the 1990s. And also don't be fooled into thinking that corporate farms are taking over. Are agricultural corporations ingrained into the day-to-day operation of most American farms? Maybe even in bad ways? Absolutely. No different from how just about all of us are affected by large corporate behemoths, nearly every day, sometimes also in very negative ways. Of the 2 million US farms today, only 5.7% are corporately owned, but nearly 90% of those corporately owned farms are corporately owned family farms. Farms that, because of their success, incorporated themselves largely for tax and other business-related purposes. Going back to the year I was born, of all US farms, only that top little sliver of black on each bar are the non-family corporate farms. So if I revisit this study in another 20 years, I imagine I'll come up with a map that looks quite similar to this one. A few more demolished farms, a few more that have been abandoned, a few that continue to house non-farming rural residents who aren't ready to move to town, or maybe even a few like myself who would like to someday move back to where they grew up. Thank you.